We're in part 3 of a series we've entitled Reassembly Required. This is the beginner's guide to relationship reconciliation. This is the beginner's guide, which means this is not exhaustive, which means as we get the chance to really unpack some of these things, this isn't going to be complete. If you are in the midst of counseling right now because of a broken relationship, you don't have to call your counselor and say, hey, we're doing this series, I don't need you anymore, because this is a beginner's guide. Our hope and our prayer is that it gives you some handles when it comes to relationships. But here's what I know is we are all a lot better at starting and maintaining relationships than really fighting for or fixing broken relationships. Isn't it easier just to push the relationships aside? I mean, if we find ourselves in a broken relationship, we tend to dive into the 4 C's, if you will. We tend to dive into convincing. We want to gather all the information and remind the person who we've got a broken relationship with exactly why we're in the right and they're in the wrong. And if convincing doesn't work, we want to convict them. We want to prove the case that they have done something wrong and it is their fault, not our fault. And then we try to coerce, and finally, what do? We try to control. But when we use these tactics to fix a broken relationship, isn't it true that it's more trying to manage the relationship? And when we try to manage the relationship, ultimately, we feel and we find that a managed relationship is just as difficult as ever, because you don't like to be managed. I don't like to be managed. And the person on the other side of the broken relationship, they don't want to be managed either. And when we try to bring these into play, what happens? We feel frustrated. We feel locked down because we are locked out. We feel shut down because all of a sudden on the other side of this relationship, we feel shut out of the relationship. Or maybe you're not an introvert. Maybe you're an extrovert. And when you find yourself in this scenario, what do? You become expressive, right? Like you begin to tell the other person why they're in the wrong. You begin to share everything, and maybe you just have outbursts of anger, and maybe it's not at the person with the broken relationship. Maybe it's at the person that you love the most. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a difficult scenario with your spouse because, well, that broken relationship has gotten the best of you. Your boss, you would not believe what my boss did to me today. Oh my goodness. And you take it out on them, and next thing you know, you've got 2 broken relationships. So one of the things we found is when it comes to broken relationships, oftentimes the reason that we have trouble fighting for them or building them up is because we tend to find excuses to help us. We tend to find excuses to help us along the way to make us feel better about ourselves. And the first excuse is this one, we tend to see a broken relationship and we begin to say this 3 simple words: I don't care. I don't care. I don't care what's going on. I don't care about this relationship. And the problem is, the tension is when you begin to see yourself thinking this, when you begin to hear yourself processing this simple thought, it's a trigger. It's a warning. It's ultimately just a little bit of a tension that we need to begin to address. Because I would tend to believe that when we say I don't care, ultimately I don't care is often what we say about things that we actually care deeply about. We say I don't care because we care deeply about this, and listen, we feel powerless. We feel powerless to do anything about it, but we wish we could. So because of the fact that we feel powerless, because of the fact that we can't do anything about it, and it's something that we care so deeply about, what do we say? We say, well, I just don't care anymore. But deep down inside, there's something in us that cares deeply. I mean, we were built for relationships. And when we say, I don't care, when we begin to say, we begin to believe the narrative in our lives, the narrative in our head that we just don't care, it's okay, I'm just gonna move on, I don't care. What happens is we take this unhealthy attitude, we take this unhealthy reality, we take this, I'm gonna say a lack of care, but ultimately it's an unresolved relationship that there's still baggage and hurt, and we carry it to the next relationship. And we carry it to the next relationship. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a scenario where there's history, there's broken relationships that are left in our wake. And we find that it's a crazy pattern, that it just keeps repeating itself. And we find ourselves on the other side saying, how do we fix this? How do we fix it? And yet we keep coming back to, well, I just don't care because I'm powerless. I really want to care. I care deeply about this relationship, but I feel so powerless. I just don't know what to do. So I just don't care. The second excuse that sometimes we run to is, I already tried. You know, when we find this word, this phrase, I already tried, that ultimately says this. It says that I'm crossing my arms and I'm done. I'm through. And the problem with this idea of, oh, I've already tried that, it's not working, I'm done with it, is because a couple of weeks ago we talked about the whole goal of a relationship is not reconciliation, but the goal is to have relationships with no regrets. The goal is that when we are in a relationship, that we would be able to have a relationship where the door is always open, where the drawbridge is always out, the welcome mat is always there, so that we can put ourselves in a posture to be able to maintain and to fight for the relationship. But when we say, well, I've already tried that, we're crossing our arms and we're saying, I'm done. I'm picking up the drawbridge. No longer is the welcome mat out, it's over. And the decision that we made, and if you've been tracking with us, if you're here last week, we said that when it comes to broken relationships, we want to encourage you to make 4 specific decisions about your broken relationships, about how to reestablish the broken relationship. And last week we said that the decision we must make is that I will get back to, not get back at. And when we decide that I've already tried, we cross our arms and we begin to say, I'm done. What happens is we're punishing, not pursuing. What happens is we're pushing them out. And we've basically undecided our first decision. That I'm not going to work to get back to, I'm done, and I'm just going to get back at. The third decision, the third excuse, if you will, that we tend to run to, I don't care, I've already tried, and it wasn't my fault. I mean, this is ultimately, we've probably all said this in a broken relationship. Well, it wasn't my fault. We've worked through the narrative in our head for so many different instances. We've worked through the narrative, the story. We know what's wrong. We were there. We clearly see what's going on. And it was their fault. They didn't come home. They broke the relationship. They fired me. They didn't see the whole story. They didn't get what was going on. It wasn't my fault. You see, the problem with that is it misses the point. In fact, the point is that when it comes to broken relationships, it's not about finger pointing and assigning blame. Because ultimately, reassembly begins with us, regardless of who initiated the fuss. Now, I know that sounds cute and pretty creative, like, hey, I'm going to run with that, right? But I also know that in life, it's the healthy and the most mature individuals that are the ones that make the first move. It's not necessarily the person who broke the relationship. Reassembly does not begin with the most at fault. Reassembly begins with us. And as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, here's what I also know, is that when it came to you, God made the first move to come after you. It wasn't that you were so good that he's like, oh, I need to bring this person back onto my team. Like, oh my. He saw you at your worst and opted to move in your direction. He opted to move in your direction in order to reestablish a relationship, not to get back at us, but ultimately to get back with us. And as a follower of Jesus, if you're not a Christian in the room, I think this is very helpful advice. But as a follower of Jesus, he has invited us, regardless of who's at fault, to make the first move. Because ultimately, I would imagine, I just see all the smiles in this room. whatever broken relationship you're in, you are the most healthy person. You are the most mature person in that relationship, right? I mean, because the other person, you know what they did to you. You are the most healthy and the most mature. So in light of that, God has invited us to mirror his example. And now, to ensure that we do this, we're going to look at a passage of Scripture today it's a narrative that Jesus, he asked a couple of questions, but he asked these questions in such a way to ensure that you and I, that we understand that when there's a broken relationship, there's something that we can do. In fact, he asked us this little pesky question that is kind of challenging. You've probably heard it before, but it's something that I hope and I pray that after today, you look at completely differently than what you've seen before. In fact, this is the question Jesus asked. He asked us, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Why are you so focused on the other person that you don't want to do anything about what you've done? Why are you so unwilling to look at yourself in the mirror, and instead you are so hyper-focused on what the other person has done? Why are you so focused on them? To which, I don't know about you, but if I'm in a conversation with Jesus and he looks at me and says, this crazy question, here's probably my answer. Hey, Jesus, it's not a speck of sawdust. Do you understand what they did? He lied to me. She broke off the relationship. She cheated on me. He never came home. I'm stuck picking up the pieces of broken relationships and I'm trying to make amends with my kids. Jesus, you're trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. It's not a speck of sawdust in their eye. Are you kidding me? Plus, if we're going to be really honest here, I don't have a plank in my eye. I mean, Jesus, I realize nobody's perfect. Nobody's got this all together. And I realize, well, nobody's perfect. You were perfect, right? Like, you've done incredible things and you've set the bar so high, but I'm pretty close to that bar. It's not a plank, Jesus. Come on. I was in the room when they said what they said. I was there. I can see clearly, and clearly it's not my fault. By the way, Jesus, if you don't mind, I'm done with this conversation. Like, could you not ask me any other questions? Like, could we just leave it at this? I'm done with this. I'm just going to wait for them to make the first move because it's clearly not my fault, which Jesus wasn't done. He had another question to ask. In fact, he says this: how can you say to your brother, permit me to take the speck out of your eye? How can you look at your friend? How can you look at the individual on the other side of the table and say, allow me to fix you? I'll tell you what, would you just allow me to correct you for a minute? You've got some issues, and I'd like to fix that, if you don't mind. How can you be so certain that you know what's going on in their life? I mean, isn't it true that we know what they should do? We're in the middle of the broken relationship. We know what they should do, but Jesus' point is, you've got it out of order. You're not ready yet to make the first move. You actually, and if we could be honest, and this is me talking to myself as much as it's me talking with you, we all have a lot of work to do. And Jesus goes on, he says, permit me to take the speck out of your eye when all the time there is a plank in your own eye. And if we look at this little phrase, all the time, it's ultimately a little play on words, right? It's this Greek term, which ultimately, it literally means when behold, there's a plank in your own eye. There's no way that you can see what's going on in their eye. Permit me to help you for a second because behold, there is a plank in your eye. Or if we could get maybe a little colloquial at this, what if we were to say this? When looky there, will you, buddy? There's a plank in your eye. I mean, you have this conversation with Jesus, and it's pretty fascinating. I don't know about you, but I tend to think that Jesus was very much a people person. And when he would have these conversations with the disciples, I can't help but think that at times he just kind of steps back and laughs a little bit. He kind of steps back and he's like, ha, ha, ha. In fact, he continues on. Kind of, you've got this plank in your eye, and he goes on and I imagine he's just laughing, and he says, you hypocrite. I know there's something on the other side of the table, but you're an actor. You're a pretender. You're trying to assume that everything is okay with you, but the problem is that you've got some work to do yourself. And since I have my own issues, I guess the reality is I should focus on my stuff. So I guess we can kind of agree that the moral of this teaching, the moral of Jesus teaching us on this is ultimately this, that we should mind our own business. So that's our takeaway for today. Let's pray. You just go out. No. Jesus didn't say this to encourage us to mind our own business. Jesus didn't encourage us with this, take the plank out of your own eye, just worry about yourself. You see, this is not a lesson on minding your own business. This is a lesson where Jesus is drawing them in and fighting for relational reconciliation. This isn't a lesson on how to run to the corner of your own self-righteousness and get everything together and center on your own reality. This is a story. This is an account. This is Jesus teaching us about how do we handle relationships. In fact, he would say we've got the order out. Like, it's not about us fighting for the sawdust in their eye, but it instead is about trying to put things in order. It's working on our business first. I think that's why he even uses the word first. He says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye. In other words, here's what we need to do. We need to identify what's going on in our life. I mean, in every relationship, right, there's some blame to go around. There's some pie that we can begin to dish out, right? There's this idea that we've all got some blame in the relationship. We've got some things we need to fight through, we need to work through. And we can come to the end and we can begin to look at the relationship and how it went awry, and we can begin to assign blame for what's happening. We can begin to look at this blame pie and begin to run with it. But isn't it true? When we look at the pie, there's a little bit of blame that we all can be assigned. I mean, when we look at what's on the other side, when we look at this idea of trying to assign blame in the relationship, I mean, ultimately, there's always some blame that we can run towards. Your slice of the pie might be just a little sliver. They might own your slice of the blame pie, right? It might just be a little piece. And they're responsible for the rest, right? Or maybe yours isn't so small after all. Maybe you've got about half the responsibility, right? But regardless of the slice of the pie, even if it is T90, even if it is so small, our mission is to try to figure out what is our responsibility. What is it in our life that we can take advantage of? In fact, I would encourage you. Maybe you're one that when you think about praying, you're like, God doesn't answer my prayers. Like, I've tried that before. We're still in this broken relationship. Like, I've prayed and I've prayed and prayed, and are you kidding me? I would encourage you over the next week. Would you make this your prayer? Would you just say, Heavenly Father, please show me where I am at fault? In fact, if you just internally begin to think through that, there's probably something that came to mind. Something that you've been pushing down, you're like, it's not that big of a deal. It's not really that big of a deal, but isn't that just a little bit of a slice of the pie that we can take ownership of? Remember, the goal is not reconciliation. If the goal was reconciliation, we would be able to manage everything and put all the pieces back together. But the goal is for us to ensure our relationships have zero regrets. And so when it comes to the regrets, we want to take ownership of our slice of the pie. And ultimately, if we will do that, Jesus makes a promise to us. He begins to promise us if we will take ownership, that something will happen in you and something will happen through you. In fact, listen to how he continues this passage. He says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and here's the promise, and then you will see clearly. Which makes sense. If your vision is obstructed, you need to take the plank out. You need to, whatever has obstructed your vision, if you take it out, then you can see clearly. But here's the fascinating part. There's no period at the end. He doesn't put a period and say, your goal is to work on you and then you're done. No, rather, this is not about you. Jesus is not trying to encourage you and say, all you got to do is work on you and then all will be well. No, he is encouraging us that the goal is not for you to feel good about yourself. The goal is always with the relationship in mind. The goal is always to find as much as you can reconciliation, to do all that you can to be able to fight for, to fight through, and to, at the end of the day, have no regrets. So Jesus says, then you'll be able to see clearly. Why do you want to see clearly? To remove the speck from your brother's eye. If we will first start with us and we'll begin to see through and think through what's going on, then all of a sudden we can move forward. We can move to, not in an effort to point fingers and say, here's what you've done wrong, but we can begin to move to so that we can not get back at, but so we can get back to. In order for us to really be able to pull a speck out of somebody's eye, it means we've got to get close. And oftentimes there's something inside of you that's an obstacle for you to get close. There's an obstacle inside of you when we don't take ownership of our blame, when we don't take ownership of our piece of the pie. What happens is we begin to look at them as if they are the ones that need the work. And we can't move close because we move close with conviction and with fingers pointed, not from a place of humility. And isn't it true that humility is what really moves relationships together? You see, for us to do this, we've got to cut our piece of the pie. We've got to identify it. We've got to admit it. We've got to own it, and then we've got to remove it as quickly as we can. And this isn't easy. Because in many relationships, this right here is what we're fighting against. Because it's easy to see the 98% that we didn't do. But when we begin to move in that direction, isn't it true that we become self-righteous? And there's a thread of self-righteousness in every one of us. And this is the very thing that Jesus hated. When he would look at the Pharisees, when he would look at the religious leaders, they weren't concerned about fixing themselves. They were so proud of who they were and what they've done that they were pointing fingers at everybody else. And that was the very thing that Jesus despised, the very thing that got him all riled up, because there's a thread of self-righteousness in all of us, where we think we're better than ourselves, where we look in the mirror and we begin to think, I've got it together. But isn't it true that self-righteousness, it gets in the way of our relationships? We think we've got it all together. We're better than. But self-awareness paves the way. Self-righteousness, it gets in the way of the relationship, but self-awareness begins to pave the way for relational reconciliation. Self-awareness is me coming before Jesus and saying, God, please identify in me where I'm at fault. Help me to take ownership of what is mine so that I can move forward, so that I can help, so that we can fight to restore the relationship. So last week we mentioned that there's 4 decisions we want you to make. When it comes to broken relationships, and this is probably helpful, like you're not in a broken relationship right now, so this is going to be helpful long-term. Take notes. It'll help you in the future, right? But we talked about there's 4 decisions, and the first one we mentioned last week was this: I will get back to, not get back at. I will get back to rather than getting back at the relationship. And the second decision that we want to encourage you to make is I will own my slice of the blame pie. I will own my slice of the blame pie. I will look at the relationship from the perspective of what is it in here that I can take ownership of? Because I want to see clearly in this relationship. I want to move forward in this relationship. I want to live this relationship with no regrets. I want to do what I can to ensure that when I look at myself in the mirror, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of how I've represented Jesus in every relationship. See, Paul would take this and he would summarize. I love how he begins to summarize this. He takes this whole idea of taking ownership and he says, if it is possible, which he's a realist. He understands that there's going to be times when it's not possible. The relationship's been completely thwarted. There's nothing you can do, and there are absolutely times when that is a reality. But many times, it is possible. And so if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, I'm going to take ownership of my slice of the pie. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you. When you look in the mirror and you begin to think, what have I done? How can I fight for this? How can I take ownership of what I have done? It's a lot easier to address, to blame, right? To throw the fingers at. But Paul would look at us and say, if it's possible, I want you to live at peace with everyone. If there's something, in fact, if you would go before Jesus and say, God, identify what is it in me that is keeping me from being able to move forward in this relationship? What do I need to take ownership of? I have a feeling he will share that with you. And if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, I want you to be at peace with everyone. That can be difficult because you owning up, taking your slice of the blame pie and going to the person with the broken relationship, even though they were the one who caused the struggle, you could be the one that helps them get past their struggles. Isn't it true that in many instances when we're at fault in a broken relationship, we hold guilt and shame like crazy? We hold this guilt and shame and we think, oh my goodness, I don't ever want to see that person. I just want to move away. Like, I just don't want to be in the same room. There's challenges and there's struggles. But if you, being the more mature, if you being the more healthy individual, if you make the first move, you might free them. You know, you're right. And thank you for apologizing. And let me tell you what I did. And next thing you know, you get this long list of things. You're like, oh my goodness, wait a second. Time out. You making the first move could be the very thing that frees them from the guilt and shame they've been harboring for so long. So ultimately, it begins with you. It begins with you making the first move. It begins with you taking ownership of your slice of the pie. And it begins with you, and ultimately, if we aren't willing to do what we're convinced that they should do, what does that make us? As Jesus would say, it makes us a hypocrite. It makes us not willing to do the very thing he's called us to do. So you're probably thinking, there's somebody I know that needs to hear this message. Like, if only my boss were in here, or how can we get this to my daughter, or how can we get this to my parents, right? Like, they need to own their slice of the pie. Here's what I would encourage you. If it's safe and appropriate, would you make the first move? Would you seek the other individual out? Would you ask them to coffee? Would you write them an email? Would you make the phone call and say, you know what? I want you to know, here's my 2%. Don't tell them that. You're responsible for 98%. Here's my 2%. Now what's up? Right? That's horrible, right? That's managing the relationship. That's coercing them. But would you live your relationships in a position of no regret? And maybe in you making that phone call, it might unlock them to begin to see, wow, I can be honest with myself. Because here's something I've learned. Something that can help us along the way. The more aware I am of what God has yet to do in me, the less aware I am and the less consumed I am by what God has yet to do in the people around me. The more concerned I am about what God has yet to do in me, man, I've got work to do. There's a lot that he needs to teach me. The more concerned I am with what he's yet to do in me, the more I am less aware of what he's done in the other people. So our mission and our hope is that you would never read this verse the same way again. That when you hear this idea of, hey, there's a plank in my eye and a bit of sawdust in their eye, that we would understand that there's a self-awareness reality inside all of us. And here's what Jesus reminds us, what he encourages us. He says, come to me, all who are weary, all who are weighed down because this relationship has been difficult. Come to me, all who are looking in the mirror and saying, there's no way I can be honest with them. There's no way I can share with them. As far as it is with me, God, this is not okay. And Jesus says, hey, God, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. If you'll follow me and do what I ask of you, I'll walk with you, and I'll be there for you. And I know it can seem difficult, but I'm in your corner, and I'm walking with you. So, today, our challenges, the decisions we must make are these two decisions. The first one that we talked about last week is I will get back to and not get back at. And the second thing, as far as it depends on me, I will take ownership of my piece of the blame pie. Reconciliation might not be the end result of the relationship, but if we take ownership, it can pave the way for fewer regrets. And isn't that what we want to do? Go to sleep at night realizing we've done as far as it is possible, as far as it depends on me, I have done everything I can to live at peace with those around me. Would you pray with me? God, we love you. And we thank you so much for the fact that God, relationships are messy. And God, in our relationships, so many times it involves me trusting you. Because God, there's times I don't want to make the first move. I would rather harbor bitterness and frustration and even look at the other person with a scowl, knowing that they are more at fault. But God, that doesn't lend itself to what you showcased us. God, when I was yet a sinner, you came across and you paved a way for me to be able to have a right relationship with you. I did not deserve it, and yet you chose not to get back at, but to get back to. So God, I pray that we would be able to do just that we would honor you in our relationships, and that we would follow after you. So God, I pray that we would make those decisions, that we would honor you, that we would choose to get back to rather than get back at. And secondly, that we would take ownership of our slice of the pie. We ask all this in Jesus' name.
Within the arms of heaven, in a peace that lasts forever, sinking deep in mercy seat. I'm wide awake, drawing close, stirred by grace. Oh, my heart is yours. it's all